Welcome and assalamu alaikum, everyone. Just verifying that we are live. Erica, can you give me a thumbs up? I just didn't see an indicator on our screen.
Yes, it's live now.
Excellent. Thank you. We are so grateful, everyone, that you're taking time to dive into this really essential topic, especially at moments when it's so easy to look the other direction. And it's essential that we look directly at at the awful that's happening and figure out a way to gather our collective humanity and do something about it. We are so grateful that you're willing to weigh in, and we ask that you make sure that you are also taking care of yourself because this is going to be a really heavy topic today. Today, we gather to speak about the children of genocide, those born into, surviving through, or orphaned by unimaginable violence. We're focusing on the Congo, Sudan, and Gaza, but our reflection can't end there. Across our world, from the Rohingya camps of Myanmar to the scarred lands of Tigray and Darfur, from the ashes of Syria's civil war to the haunting memories of Bosnia and Rwanda, echoes of mass violence continue to reach childhoods that should have been filled with laughter and learning and play. In each of these places, children have witnessed the collapse of safety. They've lost parents, homes, schools, limbs, and often the right to dream freely. And yet, in their resilience lies a question for all of us. What does it mean to rebuild humanity when the youngest among us have seen its worst? Our speakers today bring deep knowledge and moral clarity to this question. They'll help us understand not only the psychological, social, and generational impacts of this violence, but also the possibilities for healing, accountability, and hope. As we begin, I invite you to deepen your breath, to really deepen your breath as we try to hold space and honor so much of these lives who have been lost. Because they're not just statistics in reports, they're humans, each of them, an entire world of their own. And because when we talk about about genocide, we tend to generalize, but they're not just numbers and distant lands. They're people, and that's the thing that gets lost. And it's also the condition under which genocide flourishes when we dehumanize humans and we stop listening to their individual stories and connecting to their pain and their suffering and their joys and their dignity. So before we start, I invite you to join me in prayer and silence in a way that's meaningful for you. So deepen your breath. And I offer this, the Fatiha, which is the first chapter of the Quran, for the lives of those who've been lost. And I ask you to join me if you know it, but especially to join me in prayer in a way that's meaningful to you. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين صدق الله العظيم. In the name of the most compassionate, the most merciful, all praises due to God, Lord of the worlds, the most compassionate, the most merciful, Master of the day of judgment. You alone we worship, and you alone we ask for help. Guide us along the straight path, the path of those who you have blessed, and not those who you are displeased with, or those who are astray. Amen. So for our first speaker today, we have Nicolette Munabi. Nicolette will turn our attention to a tragedy that's been too often overlooked, the ongoing crisis in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where decades of conflict have left millions dead, displaced, or shattered by violence. What's unfolded in the Congo is one of the deadliest conflicts since World War II, yet it remains among the least recognized. Despite millions of lives lost since the late 1990s, systemic patterns of mass killing, sexual violence, and targeted destruction of communities were long dismissed as civil war or as ethnic conflict. It's also taken decades of testimony and advocacy and research before many experts began to call it by its true name, a genocide. The challenge has not only been the scale of the suffering, but the silence surrounding it, the global indifference, the political interests tied to the region's vast mineral wealths, and the erasure of Congolese voices, especially women and children, who have borne the heaviest burden. Nicolette Munabi has been a vital voice in breaking that silence. Through her work, she has illuminated the human cost of the violence and the resilience of those who continue to rebuild amidst the ruins. Today, she's going to help us confront the truth of what's happened in the Congo, what it means when genocide is allowed to unfold and the shadow unfold in the shadow of the world's attention. She's the founder of Munabi Consulting Group, MCG, and is an international business consultant, fundraising strategist, and passionate advocate for social impact. Hailing from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, her journey from grassroots initiatives to becoming a key player in African development embodies the resilience and innovation that MCG represents. Nicolette's leadership spans from the nonprofit and corporate sectors. As Director of Development of Eastern Congo Initiatives, she helped raise over $4 million to support water, sanitation, healthcare, and economic development programs for conflict-ridden communities across North and South Kivu in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Her corporate experience as Africa portfolio manager at the MoneyGram International provided her with deep insights into Africa, diaspora, financial flows, and economic development, particularly in key markets such as Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal, and Liberia. She has incredible leadership and will put her bio, the rest of her incredible extensive bio in the chat so you have a chance to read it directly. But for now, we turn it to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Hassan. Good morning, everyone. It's an honor to be back here with you this morning um, to join this important discussion hosted by the Islamic Center of Southern California on global humanitarian crises through the lens of genocide and its aftermath. So in my previous talk, we've explored the history of violence in the Congo. I will not revisit that history today, but I recall it because it's a crucial context for our focus, the children of genocide. So through verified international reporting, the situation in Congo has shown to not be random. It's deliberately produced by a lethal combination of competing armed groups financed by mineral exploitation, regional interventions, political manipulations of local tensions, and chronic impunity, a mix that's repeatedly transformed the lives of children in that region into victims, recruits, and survivors. So as a Congolese, I'm actually very I do not take this moment for granted to be able to actually speak on behalf of the victims, the survivors, because as Sister Hassan had mentioned, we are a country with a situation that has been going on for way too long and was overlooked as well by really the majority of the world. So I think it's very important to be a part of these discussions where we can kind of voice and put a face to some of the situations that happens on the ground. So in my country, we have seen more than 7 million people displaced by violence. This is the highest number in Africa today, and half of them are children. So it's a nation that has endured decades of conflict and seen millions of lives torn apart, especially those of children. These aren't just numbers. They represent lost childhoods, broken homes, and communities struggling to heal amid the silence and neglect that tends to happen in the DRC. Genocide and mass atrocities do not end when the fighting stops. Their impact continues through trauma, displacement, and the destruction of hope. And yet, amid all this pain, we see resilience. We see communities rebuilding. We see faith groups offering shelter and being the voice of reason in in a region where violence is all too commonplace. And we see faith groups offering shelter and also survivors transforming their suffering into strength. So today's conversation matters because it challenges us to act with compassion and courage and to see every child and every survivor as part of our shared humanity. So I will share reflections from the Congo around 7 key areas, from the impacts of children, the justice of the vital role of faith, humanitarian solidarity, and mental health in rebuilding lives. Let me go back again and just kind of restate the numbers for you. So today, more than 6.4 million Congolese people are displaced by violence, the largest displacement crisis in Africa. This is not just a number, it represents families, mothers, fathers, and millions of children living in fear and constant upheaval. The scale of this displacements reflects how cycles of mass violence continue to destroy families and futures. And I'm speaking not from theory, but from a nation that has lived through conflict after conflict, where every family has a story of loss. And so primarily the violence has been through the eastern region of the Congo. I am from the West. But even with that, right, I like I said, I went through Congo's, let's say, I think I covered maybe the last 100 years of Congo's history. Even though I lived in the West, the fact that I somehow ended up living in the US was also an indirect a consequence of what was happening in the East. So when you live in a country that is constantly plagued by upheaval or a crisis after crisis, my parents would make the difficult decision to remove us from the DRC, and I ended up growing up in South Africa because of that, and then eventually my family ended up here in the U.S. Right, and so and the work that I've done in the past has been ensuring that communities that are left in the East have access to basic services, clean drinking water, basic healthcare services. The women and the children that are impacted by the violence have access to services that restore their dignity, right? And so as we navigate the silence that has been happening around the casualties, I mentioned the last time that we've lost about 3 to 5 million people throughout this is just over the 30-year stretch of this ongoing violence that has been happening in the Congo. And as the conflict evolves, right, children are paying the price. Women and children tend to pay the heaviest price. Last year alone, 1,500 children were recruited by armed groups. The number is much larger when you widen the lens and look at it. Look at that number from a yearly you group it into like a decade or over the 30 years. We're in the, probably 500,000 children recruited into armed groups to fight fights that wars that they know nothing about. And they're basically forced into because either they're orphaned through what is happening in the situations, or and their parents are forced into situations they choose not for themselves. So children have become both the target and the tools of war. They tend to be abducted, traumatized, and denied education. And this is the hidden cost of genocide of a generation, right? We are paying for it in almost like in terms of our future because we are having generations of children basically sacrificed so that people can, because people see them as a means to an end. They don't only represent the loss of life, but also the killing of hope, right? You take away their hope and you leave children with a psychological imprint of violence and crisis as a way of life. So when we speak about genocide, I want to make sure that we include these quieter, ongoing destructions of childhood, right? The stolen childhood, and really future citizens who are that our country actually needs to be able to build a brighter future for all. That tends to get sacrificed when children are being dragged into fighting at a very young age. It can be anywhere from between, like, as young as 5. And when it's not war, they're also being dragged into forced labor. Children would be found on mines. They are subjects to sexual exploitation from a very young age. And these are some of the situations that creates the moral imperative that we all have. I really think globally, wherever genocide is happening, to ensure that we are able to protect children from some of the things that they are being subjected to in countries like the DRC, or what we're seeing in Palestine, or what we see in Sudan. So, in terms of justice and accountability, the DRC ranks among the top 3 countries worldwide for grave violations against children in conflict. So I think for me, justice, because I've been to these regions and I've been able to fundraise, again, to help support projects in these communities, the idea of justice is not revenge. It's literally the recognition of dignity and restoration of humanity for children experiencing this level of violence. So for too long, many survivors, especially women and children, have carried the pain of war without acknowledgement or reparation. This is that before now, I would say, I think it's fair to say, um, there was a struggle to recognize the suffering of these children and women, and also men, not only locally from our own government, but regionally in terms of continentally, but then also globally, right? You had the whole world basically looking the other way as to what was happening on the ground. So the current administration recently created in 2022 the National Fund for Reparations for Victims of Sexual Violence and Other Crimes, which represents a step forward toward that justice. In French, it's called FONAREV. FONAREV was created by a presidential decree in July 2022. So it's a landmark effort to provide reparations, symbolic, financial, and psychological, to survivors of conflict-related sexual violence and other crimes. It shows that the Congolese state recognizes that healing requires both justice and restitution, not just words of sympathy. As you can imagine, with systems in this place, they tend to be fragile and volatile. Implementation remains slow due to limited funding and institutional challenges. This is where the international solidarity and faith-based advocacy can play a critical role to support FONAREV's mission to ensure that survivors are not forgotten. I highlighted this morning that being back here to discuss the impact of genocide and really unsustained violence towards children on platforms such as the one that the Islamic Center for Southern California is providing is very important, because in terms of Congolese lives and Congolese children, you have had some advocacy happening on their behalf, but I think conversations around what can be concretely done, steps that can be taken to help support these communities and children as they rebuild, is super important, right? And so that brings me on to the role of faith and interfaith solidarity. In Eastern Congo, the Congo actually, in terms of its history, has gone from being, because we're a colony of a Catholic-based or a Catholic-based country, really. Over the years, you're seeing more and more diversity in terms of religious groups. I am encouraged to say that the churches and the mosques shelter thousands of displaced families in Eastern Congo, often because they're the only safe havens left. So faith communities in Congo are not just preaching peace, they're practicing it daily through humanitarian service. I would even argue that in the light of the situation, they have no choice but to almost become an extension of humanitarian services that need to be provided on the ground. Interfaith collaboration, Christian, Muslims, traditional religious practices on the ground offer a model for unity and compassion that the world can learn from, right? Because in the face of suffering, I don't think uh, faith dictates, or like, a specific faith will dictate how much compassion you show to children, to women who are being impacted at such a large scale, and are living, are being basically displaced to the point of mass communities developing in these displacement camps within the own borders of their own country. It's actually quite devastating. And so global faith networks can amplify these efforts through funding, through advocacy, and through international partnerships that can see to it that the suffering on the ground is somehow being addressed, uh, if not in terms of obviously every basic need that needs to be addressed, but in terms of safety for children, in terms of shelter being provided. I did a project last year where I fundraised for a container of books to be sent to the Western Congo. I was so happy to learn that the agency that I was working with on the ground actually used a portion of that container and made sure that the books were able to reach Goma. Goma currently is occupied. At the beginning of the year, I would say two provinces, which is the equivalent of two states here, North and South Kivu, have basically been taken over by armed groups, right? These are armed groups that are um, supposedly fighting for their rights. Government accords that were signed many years ago that apparently have not been respected as far as they're concerned. And so the latest cycle in terms of 2025 has really been from these armed groups taking over these two states, have already been volatile because they face the brunt of what the situation in the East has been. And again, you already see it's the children and the women that suffer because there's an increase of children being forced to join these groups for fighting or being sexually exploited along with the women, right? And so the role that the church can play is to obviously has been to highlight what's happening, to provide shelter to people, to the children and women who have been impacted by this, and to also show that through projects like the one that I did, where we're supporting through education, right? Providing educational materials so that there isn't such a wide gap incurred by these children because of displacement. There's no, obviously, that cuts into the way that they're able to be educated. Lives are transformed. Some of these children we're obviously going to try and support to ensure that they come back get back to being educated. But a lot of these lives are going to be forever transformed because there will be a certain number of children who will probably who have probably received, a level of education that will probably have to serve them for the rest of their lives. And it's really tragic the fact that the human capacity building is being interrupted at such a young age, and you have children who are not only getting to grow up as children, their childhoods are being cut at like 5, 6. If we overlay the trauma that's being incurred, the lack of education, as you can tell, you cannot build a country this way, right? This even if we are the fighting stops, the imprint that this trauma leaves behind on the lives of everybody around impacts even their ability to contribute into their like immediate communities. And that is really something I think interfaith solidarity and faith groups are uniquely positioned to be able to address. Because especially in the DRC, faith groups tend to have a voice that is compassionate enough to be heard both by the government and also the armed groups. So there is an advantage, there, a key positioning that the faith groups have in these situations to kind of advocate on behalf of the victims. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the mental health and the healing after trauma for these children. Over 100,000 Congolese children have received psychosocial support, yet millions more will still need it. So, as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, about 7 million people have been displaced. Half of that number, so it's about 3.5 million, are children being bathed to tolerate and to deal with all this trauma. Healing will not only be physical, because the invisible wounds of trauma are probably going to last a lifetime if unaddressed, right? So mental health must be treated as a cornerstone of post-genocide recovery and not a luxury. And I'm just going to go back to reference to the initiative that was set up by the government in 2022, FONAREV, because they take time to actually meet the survivors, listen to their stories, document their experiences, because it's a way of affirming their dignity, right? That what has happened to them needs to be heard as part of healing. It needs to be acknowledged. It needs to be documented somewhere, and then it needs to be, I think, as far as you can repair that situation, right? There needs to be a level of reparation being offered to these victims. And so mental health is primary in that sense. The government has also started offering free mental health consultations. And I think this is countrywide, but obviously mostly needed in the east of the country, where people are facing unimaginable situations and violence. And then survivors are been given the space for truth, reconciliation, and emotional restoration. Some of you may have heard of the Nobel Peace Prize recipient, Dr. Mukwege, Dr. Denis Mukwege, who is a vocal voice on the on global platforms. So he's usually at the UN General Assembly. He was there recently, and advocating still and making sure that the stories of women primarily and children are being their suffering is being documented, and it's being heard also on global stages. I think that in terms of mental health, I'd love to see a lot more platforms focus on the experience of children, the rehabbing of children after these experiences have happened to them. And then also I'd love to see us as communities that are here in the US go back to support organizations on the ground that are specifically focusing on ensuring that children's mental health is either receiving adequate funding or support or visibility into the efforts that are being done on the ground. So, as I said, the UNICEF has put out like a press release on children in conflict in 2024, and they not only highlighted the numbers of children that are kind of receiving care, but the millions more that's that still need to be done, and the key figures in which you can support and organizations that you can support. I'd encourage everyone listening today to maybe do some independent research and support any agencies whose work you feel like aligns most with personal views, etc. And then moving on, I want to speak a little bit about the global responsibility that we all have. Earlier this year, I wrote an article when the North and South Kivu, when the armed groups basically decided to take over this. In countries like the DRC, because we're so far removed, sometimes when we're speaking about these situations, it sounds very abstract because we're not directly involved, we're not directly impacted. But when you take time to study, the different factors that go into the situation we have today on the ground, you realize how all of us have a level of accountability as to what happens in these regions. As I say, the technology we enjoy today is probably has components of it, pieces and components of our devices that come from the DRC, right? And as they're being, in terms of the supply chain, it's very hard to confirm that the minerals that have been sourced to power the technology that we enjoy today are blood free. And I think that's the tragedy of it, right? So even from here, just becoming educated consumers as to how a simple iPhone that you might be buying is, um, they may be a child paying for it with their lives. There may be a child using a spoon to dig through a mine to look for coltan or cobalt that's going to end up in your MacBook or powering your Tesla. And again, I said it the last time I was here. I don't think the solution is to not use these resources. I think technology is amazing. I think advancement in technology is amazing. I just want to call attention to the fact that there are Congolese lives. There's a price being paid uh, unfairly by women and children to feed this growth and advancement in technology. And so the responsibility is, as I would say, on this end of the world is really at the very least being educated on how some of the technology we enjoy today is actually coming, what the supply chain of the products we use, just being a little bit more curious about what happens on the back end, because I do feel as consumers, we can, even if it's just advocate for better working conditions of the people who have to pull these minerals off of the ground, right? Because a lot of the fighting that's happening is really for control of the flow of these resources. And as we're supporting, or consuming these technological products, you have to understand that it makes a lot of people rich. Yes, on the back end, you look at the, annual revenue numbers or income numbers for giants like technology giants like Apple and Tesla, and that's great. But also, I think some of that prosperity needs to be shared. All the way down to the children and the communities impacted by this. The very least, I feel like, at the very least, just as much as the Tim Cooks of the world get to enjoy the salaries that they have, the very least that we can demand for are children who are not traumatized in the process, children who get to be educated, children who get to understand maybe the minerals that they're digging off of the ground, how that actually helps advance the world and how they're contributing to it. But really, as a Congolese, I'd love to see one day children being in schools, being educated up until university levels, and also beginning to innovate some of the technology that we get to enjoy globally, right? And so I will pinpoint that this is speaking directly about Congo, but worldwide, this is the case really for children that are in conflict situation. In Congo, it's tied to maybe minerals and mineral exploitation. In Gaza and Sudan, it may be different. But I think, unfortunately, it always comes down to the economy, economic benefits for some that is being paid for by others in other parts of the world. So worldwide, there are more than 50 conflicts currently putting children at risk of mass atrocity. And like I say, I'm speaking in terms of from the lens of the DRC and how the DRC is actually impacted because of this. The lesson of every genocide is that silence enables suffering. So again, like I say, a country in Central Africa, for those of us that are like sitting on other continents, it may sound very abstract and you're removed from there. but chances are even the way that you're enjoying technology is impacting the lives of innocent people. Um, and so prevention is going to require political courage on the ground globally, not just humanitarian compassion. I think that this is where there's obviously an element of the local government that has to be accountable to protecting the children and the women, and it's all its citizens. I'm always advocating for a different um, uh, uh, economic system around how mineral exploration and exploitation happens on the ground in DRC. I understand it's a very lucrative business, but I feel that it can be lucrative without women and children having to pay the price for these for the conflicts that are arising out of the situation. We must also transform empathy into sustained global actions. Like I say, on the ground in the DRC, from legal reforms to long-term investments, I do feel that these tech giants also have a responsibility um, uh, to every step on the supply chain and how minerals are sourced to how it ends up in being in the being in the final products that we get to enjoy. I think everybody can be accountable as a consumer, as producers. The responsibility should be shared, and I would like to see more of that, like consciousness being promoted throughout the world. And then to close, I'd like to say, so even amid despair, Congolese communities continue to rebuild, attempts to educate orphans and care for one another. If you go to the east of Congo, first of all, it's just beautiful in terms of like natural landscape. It's a very beautiful. It's funny. I always say, gosh, it's a shame that they insist on making money from like mineral exploitation, because I feel like we'd make a ton of money from tourism. Just the natural landscape of that part of the world is so beautiful. And amongst the suffering, you see the most smiley faces amongst the people. Um, and I'm happy to be someone who actually contributes to a journey of healing, recognizing that their dignity, advocating for the dignity of the people, of the children, of the women who have had to face unimaginable violence. The belief that every survivor story matters, and that we can unite across faiths and nations to ensure that justice and compassion and recovery are not abstract ideals, but are living realities, right? So the future of Congo and all humanity depends on how we choose to respond to the suffering of children today. Thank you very much. I believe that was 30 minutes. I hope I covered ground on what I needed to do, but thank you. Thank you for the opportunity again.
Thank you. You really did. And you really challenged us to think about what our role can be in both the showing up in a curious way that doesn't do extra harm. Because I know that in other past places, like there's been big outcry on specific things, and then they eventually do more harm because the economy suffers in some way, and the kids who are actually needing the help actually then get less support. And so not having unintended harm also come of our action. And you really challenge us to think too about reparation, also in terms of a form of mental health, schools, access to opportunities, and the kind of things that we can build. And I want to ask you, it sounds like each of us have a role to play, and if we could just focus on our each of our lanes, like if you have strength in education, if you have strength with helping think about, like, it sounds not just like it's something you really have to listen to deeply. It's not just a fix of whatever you're going to do, even if you're listening and holding space for people, that has a really important role. And so each of us focusing in an area where we have some strength sounds really important. And I'm curious if there's any specific ways that you've seen places where people can lean in to that, where there's already like resources that people can lean into, where they can support.
Yeah, so I think in a country like Congo, I remember at some point we were actually on the news because Goma, one of the cities that's unfortunately been taken over again this year, had about 10,000 nonprofits in there trying to address what was happening on the ground, like the crises that were unfolding. I think as someone, like I said, who has experience in both nonprofit and corporate experience and for profit, I think that partnership is so important in these situations. Um, I don't want to have to go on the ground in Goma and create something new when I can find the agencies that have been there maybe for the last 30 years, the groups that have been there for 30 years that understand the local context, that have the local networks to be able to actually affect meaningful change. And so, in that sense, I say the resources is obviously doing your own research. And I'm always happy to help guide, action on the ground or, make introductions to people doing the work. But I think it's very important that the groups that have shown themselves to be credible partners, communities, as you can imagine, if I'm going through something and there's 10,000 different groups claiming to help me, some genuinely there for for genuine change, and others just looking to exploit the situation, I become very what is the word, apprehensive about about newcomers, right? So I feel like it's always better to go in with people who have local expertise and have history, have shown themselves to be credible partners on the ground, and to lean into their expertise and resources before trying to engage, do anything that to help. And so I feel like despite good intentions, it's really good to make sure you have the right partners when attempting to support any effort on the ground.
Beautiful. Thank you. And then we've like for people who are because we're in Southern California and the for the because I know that there's also diaspora communities that are also that come this way, right? And so for the people that are here, they're still holding trauma. And I heard you like bearing witness and being there. Um, are there specific things in Southern California where people can be supportive to anything locally?
Yeah, I'm not from Southern California. I'm actually in Atlanta, Georgia. But what I would say is it's good to kind of have these discussions because sometimes, and I'm not saying every single person from Congo is a victim, right? Um, my life was impacted by the instability in the DRC, but I can't claim to maybe have gone through the experiences that a woman in Eastern Congo has actually gone through.
Mm.
Our experiences are very different, and our levels of trauma is very different, right? Mine might be due to secondary displacement, but some of these people have had to I went to a village last year outside of Bukavu, and it was literally, I'd never seen anything like it. It was just like villages of nothing but children because the adults were, because of displacement, the adults had to go back to the villages they knew to try and earn money. But it's almost like a situation that was baffling, but I also couldn't relate to. But at the same time, I could understand this is not safe in a country that's dealing with so much like sexual violence to leave to have gaggles of children being left unattended, right? Because the adults have no choice but to go figure out a way that they're going to feed their families and their children. So I would say I'm veering off a little bit, but it's to come back to say sometimes understanding people, understanding where they're coming from. Like, again, that's why I feel like curiosity is a superpower because I may not know what it's like to live in the Middle East, but I've read books. I'm keeping up with what's happening on the news. I'm seeing the unimaginable situation people in countries like Sudan and Palestine are being subjected to. Um, and really being made to pay the price for agendas that are not even their own, right? Which is unfair. And I think in terms of mental health resources, you can imagine that it would be helpful to anyone coming from any one of these countries. I don't really need to know a specific story about people to kind of understand that. And so just making sure, I think that, like, like maybe through the center, if there are resources that are free, just be making sure that you're highlighting it. I don't know if it's on boards or, how you do it, because I haven't had the time to actually, the opportunity to physically
Mm.
visit the center. But I feel like this is what you can do. Like, just uh, maybe gather information on lists and resources that can be available to people for mental health, and be able to publish it so people know that they can go there when they need it. And I think it's the same thing here in Atlanta as well. It actually has a large number of Congolese migrants, but it's good to know that as a community you can lean into some of these resources and know where to find stuff. I think that's very important.
Right, and especially preemptively. If we know this is actually a really big need, like it can be ready in some way, even though
Yeah.
this is so big and really hard to hold. But we're so grateful that you have taken this time to help us understand more deeply about what both the dynamics, but also like how we can be more curious in ways that could be hopefully helpful. We're so grateful for your time. Thank you.
Thank you. This is Hassan. Thank
You're
you.
welcome. Thank you. Our next speaker is going to guide us through the urgent and painful humanitarian crisis in Gaza, and the devastating impact of violence on children. Over, oh, it feels like a million years, the world has watched as Gaza's children have endured staggering loss and trauma. Entire families have been erased, schools and hospitals have become shelters and then targets, and the very spaces meant to protect life have been turned into zones of fear and terror. A growing number of voices and institutions have raised alarm about what's unfolding, from the International Criminal Court of Justice, recognizing the plausible case of genocide and ordering provisional measures, to the United Nations experts, human rights organizations, including Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the Lemkin Institute, as well as respected scholars of genocide and international law. They've all warned and have been sounding the alarm. And even governments and parliaments, as part of the Global South and Europe, have echoed these concerns. These declarations aren't made lightly. They reflect a global recognition that when so many children are killed, displaced, or deprived of food, water, safety, we're witnessing not just a humanitarian catastrophe, it's a moral crisis that we are bearing witness to. And our speaker today is going to help us understand what it means for Gaza's youngest generation, for these children growing up under siege and loss, and what it demands of us as a global community committed to protecting life and dignity. So we are joined today by Lubna Hamad. She's a Palestinian American civil rights advocate, lawyer, and seasoned community organizer. She holds a Master's of Law, LLM, from the University of Pennsylvania Law School. Prior to relocating to the U.S., Lubna served as general consultant for UNICEF in Jerusalem, where she led the design and implementation of child protection programs across Gaza and the West Bank. She also worked with the Defense of Children International in Palestine. And in the US, Lubna co founded Adala New York, a grassroots organization advocating for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and Yalla Indivisible, a nonprofit dedicated to civic engagement and the empowerment of BIPOC communities with a special focus on Palestinian and Arab Americans. You'll see her bio in the chat. And we are so grateful, Lubna, that you are here despite you're dealing with illness. And we're so grateful, not just for you, but for your family. We're so grateful that you're here with us. Please.
Well, thank you so much, Aziza, and thanks to the Islamic Center. I'm really grateful for this opportunity to talk about what's happening in Gaza and the genocide against children. Um, I will try to share my screen. I hope that works. Okay. Let me know if you can see my screen.
We see it.
Okay. So we'll talk about I was going over my um, so good morning. Um, Today we're witnessing, we're bearing witness to what has become the most documented genocide in modern history. It's a tragedy by itself that this, what I just said, has almost become a cliche, that it's been said so often that this is the case. It is the genocide of Palestinian children in Gaza. This presentation draws on the verified findings of UNICEF and Defense for Children International Palestine and other UN agencies and human rights bodies. The goal is to see clearly, to understand legally, and to act morally. One little disclaimer: most of the figures and the numbers that and the facts that I'm going to be using today are definitely an underestimate of what is actually happening on the ground. So, why we begin with children? Because they are the moral lens of the genocide. Every statistic we cite is actually a name, a family, and a future cut short brutally. When we center children, we center the truth about violence, its innocence, its scale, and its collective responsibility. So how does international law define genocide? Because we keep hearing a lot of back and forth. Is it genocide? It's not a genocide. It's a genocide. There's no question about it. So under Article 2 of the 1948 Genocide Convention, genocide means acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, including killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm, deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to destroy the group, imposing measures to prevent births, and forcibly transferring children. These are not really abstract clauses. These are legal standards by which everybody is judging what's happening in Gaza. So let's talk about the scale of destruction. Again, these are very conservative estimates. I have to keep reminding myself of that because sometimes I find myself parroting those. So over 14,000 children killed, or Israel killed more than 14,000 children in less than 1 year. So this number, the genocide has been going on for almost 2 years now. You can imagine how much larger the number is. According to UNICEF and DCI Palestine, the rate of child killing in Gaza has surpassed that of all other conflicts combined in 2023. The rate of Israel killing children is 1 Palestinian child every 10 minutes. Going back to why we center children, why we talk about children in genocide, because there's nothing in the world whatsoever in any way, shape, or form that could or would justify killing a child every 10 minutes. The second element is causing serious bodily harm. So tens of thousands have been injured. And again, unfortunately, the recurring theme from Gaza is children having to go to have amputations without any anesthesia. So with over 70% of hospitals, many suffering amputations without anesthesia as hospitals run without fuel or electricity. So doctors describe treating multiple generations of the same family on the same operating table. This is insanity. The other element is starvation and health collapse. With over 70% of hospitals destroyed and Israel blocking fuel, food, medicine, children now die not only from bombs, but from hunger and dehydration. So the WHO and OCHA confirmed cases of malnutrition and infant deaths from starvation in northern Gaza. And I believe the number I last checked was a total of almost 500, like 450 or something. And of these, 154 children starved to death. So starvation is not a byproduct of the war. It's a weapon of annihilation that is employed very deliberately and supported by all the governments in the West. The deliberate conditions of life. So Israel's total siege cuts food, water, fuel, and medicine. We've just said that. It is a pattern that meets Article 2C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction. This is not neglect or chaos, it's design. And I just want to diverge very, very quickly here and say, when Israel chooses when Israelis choose their target, what they do, they choose in a pattern that will make sure that families will not continue. They have the full civil registry of everyone in Palestine, every single person. All of us are in the civil registry that Israel has. So when they're targeting a certain family or a certain building or a certain school, they know exactly how many children are there. They know exactly that all the children of this family is there. So they're preventing birth in so many other ways, that not to mention what pregnant moms go through, etc. This is just another way of preventing births. So talking about education under siege, and education is paramount for any sense of normalcy of life. So every university in Gaza has been destroyed. And over 80% of schools are damaged or leveled. However, teachers do continue. I don't know how they do that. I really, honestly, I'm in awe of their resilience and their courage. Teachers continue to do remote lessons through phones and through WhatsApp, proving that education itself is an act of resistance. And if you allow me also to diverge for a little sec and share a little story with you. In May of this year, I was on a conference call with university professors, and we're talking about education in Gaza, and we were supposed to have a few speakers. One of them was a professor from Gaza who was gonna join us live. However, he was not able to. And the reason he was not able to was that his house was bombed that very morning. So imagine that professor going through that. And what does he do? He puts his he puts his laptop under his arm and walks for 3 kilometers to the nearest quote unquote internet cafe to record a video of his speech to share with us. The level of resilience, the level of commitment that our people in Gaza are showing, he's doing that not for himself, he's doing that for his students, for his community. That's what we're seeing in Gaza in face of this absolute destruction that is inflicted on them. Sorry, I think I, okay. So yeah, so the next slide talks about the displacement and orphanhood. The figure that, again, that we have right now is 1.7 million people are being displaced. The majority of the Palestinian community is children. The majority of these Palestinians is children. Of Gaza's 40,000 orphans, Gaza has already have 40,000 orphans. Of those 20,000, half are under 10 years old. UNRWA calls this a generation without a home and without a childhood. That's an understatement. The psychological trauma that affects children. When I was working with UNICEF, that was one of the hardest things that we ever encountered when we were doing child protection programming, because the psychological trauma is something that lasts a lifetime. So it's and the intensity of it is one of the hardest things to deal with, especially with the war ongoing nonstop, under fire. So children who survive wake to the sounds of drones and nightmares of explosions. DCI Palestine documents cases of speech loss, bedwetting, and trauma from witnessing family members killed. Trauma is not invisible. It's a form of serious mental harm recognized under Article 2B. Talking about law and accountability, and I know that the whole legal system has taken a huge hit, if not complete collapse, because of what's happening in Gaza. So 4 of Article 2's 5 acts have been documented in Gaza. In January 2025, the International Court of Justice found that Israel's actions plausibly constitute genocide and ordered immediate measures to stop the killing and allow humanitarian aid. The International Criminal Court has since opened proceedings against senior Israeli officials. So the law is speaking the word that morality has been screaming, which is genocide. And I apologize for the legal community for our slowness. So the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, the ICC, the International Criminal Court, UN experts like Francesca Albanese, and genocide scholars now concur that Israel's conduct in Gaza meet the legal definition of genocide. There's no question about it. Which brings us to the situation here. Despite all of that, despite this consensus, the United States and European states continue to send weapons and political power. Now, we've seen a shift in the last couple of weeks where they're recognizing the state of Palestine, which is really nothing, a nothing burger, as people here say. But we continue to ship weapons to them without a question. And the most striking fact is every 15 hours, we in the US ship weapons to Israel. And every 15 hours, those weapons, Israel uses those weapons that are taken away, the cost of which is taken away from our healthcare, our schools, our education, our housing, and misconducted or misallocated to this genocide. Israel takes these weapons and kills at least 150 Palestinians. Every morning we wake up to the news, another 15 Palestinians killed. Now the number is 28. Now it's, or like, you're probably more familiar of this than I am, or equally. So on the bright side, if there's ever a bright side to a genocide, if Gaza and the Palestinians in Gaza are known for anything, they're known for the resilience, the unparalleled, unbelievable resilience. So, and resilience in Arabic is sumud. So resilience in rebuilding, sumud. Families teach, they plant, they rebuild among the ruins. They turn the hum of drones into songs of life and memory. Their sumud, their steadfastness, their resilience is a living form of justice. And you probably saw this. It's one of the songs that I keep listening to, and I don't really listen to a lot of songs these days. But we have a Palestinian music teacher, Ala Abu Ghalioun. did a master class with his children, with his students, when they heard the humming of the drone. And he showed them how he can, with his own will, transform this humming of death into a song of life and survival. And this song has gone viral. Even under siege, he invited the children to sing instead of being afraid, or to face their fear with singing. Even under siege, they learn harmony in defiance of death. That is the sound of Palestine's survival. Models of protection. So one of the amazing organizations that I've been following and keeping up with is the Ta'awun. And Ta'awun has now started a Noor Gaza Orphan Care program that offers psychological, psychosocial support and educational continuity for children who have lost their families. It is a model of community-based care that reminds us protecting children is not charity. It's justice in practice. We're not doing this because we're good-hearted. We're doing this because this is what justice looks like. Restoring childhood. This is, again, I don't want to give an impression that Gaza, everything is fine and we're able to do this. They're doing these things under extreme conditions, and a lot of times they're unable to do it. They're unable to do it in Gaza, so they do it in their communities outside of Gaza, sometimes in Egypt, sometimes in other places. But whenever they can do that in Gaza directly, these people are on the ground doing it. So we are recreating, Palestinians are recreating community schools in shelters and rubbles. And we have a long history of doing that, starting with the first Intifada, when Israel shut all the schools and just the community responded by opening schools at home, so that the generation of the Intifada, the first Intifada, that did not grow up illiterate and ignorant. So we have a long history of that. They're teaching reading, drawing, math, and restore a sense of normalcy and hope, because their sense of their community is so real. They know that this is what's going to bring childhood to their children. To bring back childhood is to resist erasure. So with this, with all the heavy news that I've just shared, let's talk about what we can do. So, and there is something we can do, and there is something that we have to do. So we do need to organize across borders, of course, and we've seen what the flotilla, the Sumud flotilla, did in the last few days. From ports to classrooms, to stop the flow of weapons and sustain Gaza's life. The number one priority for all of us. I mean, let's not even think about these so-called peace talks. People can have all the peace talks they want. As long as the weapons are flowing, the genocide is not stopping. It's as simple as that. The only way right now to stop the genocide is to stop the weapons from flowing from the US specifically. Yes, there are other Western countries that still send weapons, but it's mainly us. It's mainly the US that has that, I don't want to say honor, dishonor. So there are forms of solidarity that we can take. So every institution, every union, every community has a role to play in child protection and ending this genocide. I've listed a few things here, and I'm sorry that I actually was absent-minded to post the the QR codes and the links, but I will send them to you, and I'll try to put them in the chat in a minute. Right now, we do have a petition to the AFL-CIO and the CA Labor Federation, and it's very, very specific. It's asking them to recognize that what's happening in Gaza is genocide and act accordingly and organize their ranks and their workers to stop the flow of weapons. That's the last resort that we have. We know that our government is not going to do it. And if they're going to do it, they're going to do it at a very high cost. We are right now the only resort, the last resort for people in Gaza to stop this. We need to use all of our power, all of our people power, and focus, laser focus on stopping the weapons shipment. If the flow of weapons stop, the genocide will come to a halt. They can't kill us if they don't have the weapons. Again, very simple, very basic. And who's supplying the most weapons? The dishonor goes to the United States. Those weapons don't make themselves, they don't ship themselves, they don't load themselves. We do. And by standing against the weapons shipment, we're also vitalizing our own resistance to deal with whatever we're having right here. So these things are not disconnected. Oh, sorry, let me just go back. So, and on October 24th, if you all know the Amazon union organizer, Chris Smalls, he and other community and labor organizers will be in DC to deliver this petition that we're hoping to get at least 20,000 signatures to deliver it to the headquarters of the AFL-CIO, which is one of the biggest labor entities in the country. There's another very different effort, but no less important. This is the Feed Gaza Tatriz Initiative, or Global Stitch Along. This is something that was launched by Lina Barqawi, who's a Tatriz artist. And she, along with Shams Collective in Palestine, I believe, they've designed special motifs, special embroidery, Tatriz Palestinian embroidery motifs for Gaza. And when you buy those motifs, 100% of the proceeds go to mutual aid that goes directly to Gaza, that they themselves oversee, that gets to families and children. And this is something that is very, very helpful right now. This is something that you can do right now. And with this, there's going to be also a toolkit where the proceeds of which will go to the Ta'awan Noor's Orphans orphan care program as well. And there's another initiative that is now being launched this Tuesday, which is the Crochet for Palestine, where we're trying to crochet 10,000 hats that we're to raise awareness about the plight of children and Palestinians in the genocide. And we're hoping to send to Gaza with messages of love and care. I know nothing is going in or out, but we're hopeful. And before we send them, we're going to take them to Congress, and we're going to demand that our Congress representatives work with us to allow baby formula and those crocheted beanies and hats be delivered to Gaza. Now, these are tiny, as you can tell, these are not monumental efforts, but here's the thing. We all have to keep contributing every drop to the bucket until the bucket overflows and until we get to the tipping point. And we're very close to the tipping point. Look at what's happening in Italy. Look at what's happening in Spain. Look at what's happening at the flotilla and the aftermath. So all of that, if you're burnt out, or if you're not able to beyond signing the petition, beyond donating, these are little things that help, that help adding drops to the bucket, but also help you connect with Gaza, help you reflect with Gaza and the children of Gaza. When I just had someone who donated 25 hats, and I couldn't help but think the time that she spent making these hats, she must have devoted a lot of thinking, a lot of thought into what life is right now in Gaza, the children of Gaza, the people of Gaza. And that is what we're hoping to do through these initiatives. Thank you. Let me.
Uh,
Oh, and I just want to show that if one last thing and I'm sorry, the children of Gaza are the measure of justice. To protect them is to protect humanity itself. These children have the right to live. They must live, learn, and dream again, and it's our responsibility to do that. And for anyone who wants the resources of the facts that I shared here, there. And Aziza, I will share this with you all as well. And I'm trying to stop the share. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you so much. You have really brought to light the resilience, the enormous suffering, but also the essential work that we all need to be doing to figure out, or not to figure out, to step up in big ways. I know Sister Hidab is going to also help us out with some questions, and I'm curious if you can stay on for just one question, if
Yeah,
that.
absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Uh, you made it mostly clear. The children of Gaza are suffering in exponential ways, and especially you named the orphans. And I'm curious if there's any, like you named some really important collaboratives. Are there specific ways that people can help, especially with children, whether it's orphans and education or um, ways to like what we heard with our last speaker too was people also need a chance at education. And I imagine like even with the resilience, they still need resources. And so I'm curious if there's ways or things that already exist that people can help with.
Absolutely. The two organizations that I follow up with and support are definitely Defense for Children International, although they're not as active in Gaza. They're extremely active in the West Bank, and let's not forget the West Bank because the genocide and the ethnic cleansing is also starting and coming and accelerating on that level. So Defense for Children International, I'll drop the links in a minute in the chat for those. I've worked with them 20 years ago, and I know how credible their work is. I know how connected they are to the community. But the one organization that I'm particularly fond of is Ta'awun. Ta'awun has two crucially important programs. One is the Noor's Gaza Orphan Care Program that I mentioned, and that when I talked to them last year, they were talking about 17,000 orphans that they identified that they were able to, that they're planning or they're working on providing, and were providing at some level some services like psychosocial support over the phone, etc. So that is a very, very important um, program, especially now that these children, they have, now that they've lost their families and everybody in Gaza almost lost everything, it's very important that they stay with their community, that they get cared for by their community and not be sort of taken out of our community in Gaza or Palestine. So that is an enormously important program that I hope everyone will be able to support. And you can just go there and adopt or sponsor an orphan. I will share the link. And the other program that also Ta'awun did, and that's what the professor back in May told us about, was really a backbone of their educational effort, is called ISNAD. And that might be more geared towards university students, but also I think they're trying to extend it to school students. And that is providing internet and resources for children and for young adults to continue their education and not be deprived and resist through getting their education. Of course, there are other organizations here. We all know them, PCRF and Heal Palestine and all these wonderful organizations. But for me, the most important and the more often overlooked are Ta'awun, two amazing programs, ISNAD and Noor's Gaza program, and Defense for Children International.
Thank you for that. Thank you so much for joining us, especially while you were sick. And if in the list of links, if you could also just send us something around, I mean, you explicitly named multiple times how important it is to stop the flow of weapons. And so if you have any specific ways that people can, it's such a big problem. and it's
Yeah.
something that's in our backyard. And so if there's ways for people to flow into something somebody's already working on that you value, that would be.
Yeah, we're part of a national effort to organize for this petition and the delivery of the petition. So I'll drop in the petition form, and once people sign it, they will be informed of all the upcoming events and actions that are gearing towards. The sole focus of this is stopping the shipment. I think we're going to call it disarm genocide. We haven't yet finalized the name, but I think that's the name that we're. And once people sign the petition, they'll definitely get informed. And what I would ask people is to share this petition, because we need as many people as possible. There's always extreme urgency when it comes to Gaza, an absolute urgency to stop the shipment of the weapons.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time and your efforts, and the way that you're clearly pulling in more than your fair share of weight, like, and the resilience you're showing that is possible in these moments where it's important for us all to come together.
Thank you.
We're so grateful for your time. So Sister Lubna had agreed to join us, even though she's truly working through illness herself and through her home. And so Sister Hidab Tarifi, who needs no introduction, has also agreed to be with us to help, especially lean into more of the questions, so that we just have a little bit more time before we move on with our program. Sister Hidab, like you've been involved in so many different places with organizing and pulling people together. We would love to hear, especially specific efforts along the lines of any places that you feel like are essential for people to flow into.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. And thank you, Aziza. Thank you, Erica, and the team at the Islamic Center for organizing this. And I'm definitely grateful for the speakers, especially Lubna, for coming through, even though she's sick herself. Now, the situation we've been going through with this genocide in Gaza, it's been already 2 years. 2 years that is just not acceptable for it to even be 1 day. And with the lack of real movement to end the genocide, coming from whether the United Nations, leadership across the world, it really puts the load and the pressure on the people. The people can make the change. Lubna alluded to what is happening in Italy, for example. I mean, the unions in Italy literally shut down the country for 1 year, forcing the government to send ships to protect the last Sumud flotilla. Even though, yes, they didn't go through all the way, but let alone, the people forced the government to do something, even though the government, especially the prime minister, is very well known to be a Zionist supporter of not just Israel, but supporter of Netanyahu. So back to here in the United States, what we, the people, can do, as far as I'm concerned, each one of us should do. There are different levels. There is the personal level. There is the local level in your city, in your town. And of course, there is the national level with DC and our representatives there. So let's start with the individual. As Lubna mentioned, there are a lot of organizations that are actually on the ground helping people in Gaza. And most of the time, honestly, they are Gazans helping Gazans, which I personally very much appreciate. There were times when a lot of the international organizations, for safety, whatever reasons, they left. And Gazans were left to be supportive of one another. And we need to support these initiatives. Any organization that is on the ground working, helping Palestinians to survive and to persevere against this genocide, so that they can stay in their homes, stay in the land, and not be forced to be ethnically cleansed and moved out of, pushed out of Gaza. So we need to support that, whether we support their education, their mental health, their survival, their food, their shelter. There are so many different ways that we can help. And please look for authentic organizations, because there are a lot of campaigns there that are not necessarily legitimate. And I make myself available for anyone who wants to verify, a place to donate. So that is the donation. Of course, the prayers, the dua, that's the least we could do, but we shouldn't be forgetting that on a daily basis, people are killed, massacred. And we owe it to them to at least make dua for them, pray for their safety. So on that is on the personal level. But then we have time, we have a voice, and we have friends, we have connections, and we shouldn't be ignoring these gifts that God Almighty had given us, because if we don't use them, we will be questioned at the day of judgment why we didn't use them. We should use our voice and our network to educate people about this genocide, because there are a lot of attempts to even discredit us from calling it a genocide. We can easily change people's hearts by communicating, by educating, and by getting involved, whether with our colleagues, our friends. But the most important one is coming to the local, where each one of us live in a city, each of us work in a city. We contribute to these cities. And we need to demand that our representatives within each city hear us and hear our voice. I'll give Pasadena as an example. A group of volunteers, interfaith volunteers, they have been literally working so hard since November 2023, pushing for, at the beginning, ceasefire resolution, educating people who are passing by on the street every single week. And now they're pushing for the city that is investing in companies that are directly benefiting from this genocide. That is not acceptable. And perhaps many of those who are benefiting, their investments and their retirements are benefiting, are not even aware that their retirement is coming from blood money. That's something else that we can and we should do something about. Education, demanding, going to the city council, demanding that they divest, demanding that whatever board is overseeing those investment put together an ethical investment. And it's not just, it's not just, the major companies. There are a lot of companies that sadly, one way or the other, supporting the genocide, and we need to identify them, and we need to make sure that no one, including ourselves, we look at our own investments, our own 401k. We need to make sure that we are not participating in this genocide in any possible way, and educating others and forcing cities to divest. Of course, we can do that with companies, but let's start at least with our representatives in our own local cities, because that is important. When you start with the city, then you can take it to the next level, which is the state, and then you can take that afterwards and you go to the Congress and Senate. This is critical. We all have phones, we all have smartphones. Not a day should pass without us calling and demanding an end to the genocide, demanding, as Lubna said, the key is to stop arming Israel. As long as Israel is being armed by, sadly, the United States, they will continue the genocide. President Trump the other day demanded, immediately after Hamas accepted the offer that was put on the table by President Trump, and he told Netanyahu, stop bombing Gaza. And did Netanyahu stop bombing Gaza? No, he didn't. So as long as there's a pipeline of all these weapons going to Israel, Israel will continue with the genocide, will continue finding a way to massacre more Palestinians. And by the way, I have to say that the genocide is not just happening in Gaza. Yes, it is a mass scale of genocide in Gaza, but there's another genocide happening in the West Bank. And we need to pay attention that there is an attempt to annihilate Palestinians off the face of the earth. And we, as humans, are responsible to make sure that that doesn't happen. So every possible way, every resource we have, we shouldn't be silent, and we shouldn't be taking a step back, because at the end of the day, it is our responsibility. And the people have the ability to make a difference if they organize, or even if they just use their time and use whatever resources and blessing that God Almighty had given us, because we all are accountable.
Indeed, we are, each of us, and making sure that we are stepping in the most important ways, in the capacity that we can. I want to, you named especially also like the West Bank, and one of the key conditions, or one of the things that happen in genocides across the globe, is that there's this process of dehumanization, that where people are literally created or named into like first evil, then or whatever, they're not human, there's some kind of subhuman, and then the conditions for genocide become so much like it's a tidal wave that comes through. And part of it too is what gets lost is the individual human story. And the neuroscientists that have studied groups of people in conflict, is they've talked about how essential it is to share the individual human story, like Hind Rajab and the agony that she suffered of begging for her life as she was being shot at after her family was killed in a car, and begging for someone to come get her, and then an ambulance coming and risking their own lives, and then also being killed, and not letting go of those, making sure people hear those stories. Because that's the part that so gets lost over and over. Like, yes, these are huge numbers, and they each deserve to have their stories named, but also their pain and their suffering. And so I wanted to lean in, and I know this, you have lost so many family members, in the hundreds now, and and I know this isn't an easy question. What are the stories that you feel like people need to hear?
Oh God, that is definitely, for me personally, it's definitely a tough question for all the family members I've lost in Gaza. But honestly, at this point in time, everybody in Gaza is my family. And I appreciate that you mentioned Hind's story, because Hind is one of hundreds of thousands that have been killed in Gaza. And each one has a story. Whether they're adults, whether they're seniors, whether they're mothers, grandmothers, or children or babies. And we have to know these stories, and we have to tell them, because sadly, the media in the West is not going to tell them. Let's look at Hind in particular. The media in the West, when the news came out of how she was killed and how she was on the phone, seeking, help and begging for the aid to come and get her, the media in the West made it sound like she's an adult woman. Part of the dehumanization is to erase the identity of the Palestinians and erase their story. In Pasadena, for example, I keep mentioning this group, Pasadena for Palestine, because that is one thing that they are doing. We set up vigil where we put pictures and names of kids who were killed. And in many times we tell their stories, how they were killed. I mean, I'll give you an example of just one member of my family, one member. And I hope there are no kids here and if there are kids, please, parents, close their ears. My cousin, her eldest son, when he was bombed, when he was killed, along with his in-laws, they literally had to collect his body parts to put them in a bag and bury him. That is just one story. There are stories now of people in Gaza who are bombed without even their families or the aid workers finding their body parts. If you hear now of what Israel is doing, they're bringing all these tanks or old tanks, and they're filling them with explosives. That the explosive, when they send them to a place where it's a building or even a tent and blow it, the power of the explosion literally makes the bodies disappear. A kind of genocide that I've never heard of, I've never even thought I would hear of, let alone see it. So we shouldn't let these go unnoticed, untold, and not honor these people. So the list of Palestinians who are facing these kind of unacceptable death shouldn't just be going unnoticed or untold or in vain. It is not about me, it is not about my family, it is about every single person in Gaza. And again, I keep saying, don't forget the West Bank, because the West Bank are facing, it's a miniature genocide, but it is another attempt to ethnically cleanse Palestinian and steal their land and steal their identity. Lubna's back. Lubna will do a better job. Thank you.
No, my heart breaks every time I hear you say that, go through those stories, Hidab. I mean, Allah يعطيك القوة والصحة. It must be very hard.
It is absolutely hard, but back to where I'm
We have no other option.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
If I can swallow my pain, if I can swallow my anger, if I can swallow my frustration, and honestly, I reached the point where I'm really mad at the world, but I'm still trying to control my anger so that it doesn't turn into hate. But if I can do that, and I'm the one who is directly impacted, what excuse do others have?
100%.
Yeah.
And I just want to, if I may, Aziza, just say something very quickly.
Please.
The last thing you mentioned, and it's one of the hardest things as well. I mean, everything is hard, to be honest about this, but that the weapons that are used basically obliterate the people. Like, you won't even have a shrapnel or like anything that's left of them. The first thing that the guilt that immediately catches on me, which is that I am paying for this with my tax dollars. We are all doing that. So that's number one. Number two, they're experimenting on our people in Palestine so they can profit from this and sell it to other oppressive regimes and even bring it home. And that's the point that I wanted to make here, is that this is not far removed from our reality. There's plenty of evidence now how a lot of the policies, a lot of the tactics and strategies that Israel used and experimented with on the Palestinians are being used here against our own communities, especially communities of color. Whether it's surveillance, the surveillance, the biometrics, whatever, that they find every Palestinian, whatever they are, ICE uses that. all the oppressive tactics, everything is used against us back home and here at home as well. So when we're standing up for Palestine, when we're standing up against the genocide, we're not doing this as a favor to Palestine. I mean, we owe it. There's a moral and legal obligation, and there's a responsibility beyond the moral, because this is our tax dollars. Our country, our government has forced us to be complicit in a genocide that we totally reject. So, yes, I've shared some of the calls to action with you here, but also we shouldn't always be waiting for other people to tell us what to do. Find something that you can do. Find something that you can do. I'm sure people will think of a million ways that are productive and creative to fight the genocide. The simple thing as boycotting products that benefit the Israeli apartheid system. But just know that when you're fighting for Palestine, when you're fighting for those children in Gaza who had to go under amputation without anesthesia, you're fighting for your own kids here. You're fighting for your own people here. You're fighting for the oppression that is looming very, very large over our heads right here. That money that went to those weapons that is funding the genocide is taken away from the food of people who are living under poverty. In LA, it's taken away from the tax dollars that we could use to provide housing for the thousands and hundreds of thousands who are unhoused in our own backyard. So let's think collectively. Let's think that this is not just doing it for Palestine. Do it as if it's your own children, because it is your own children who are going to be at risk. Thank you.
Thank you for coming back, Lubna, and you help us also remember that like the violence that is used isn't isolated. It actually has this rippling effect that impacts us well beyond the places where the violence is initially used. And it mushrooms and it grows way beyond anyone's control. And it does enormous harm. And so to think that it's isolated and that it won't impact is simply not true. And that we have to find ways. And you're urging us to work on the creative ways where we have influence. And thank you for putting in all the links. So Lubna has put into the link, into the chat, a number of links. And if I could ask Hidab, if you have a link to the group, not in Pasadena and or the list that you were talking about, so that people have something to cross-reference or work from, that would be appreciated. I wanna especially also, like you also named Hidab the West Bank, and there's people, literally kids who are trying to go to school or trying to get across to a place, maybe it's like a person's home that they are related to and they're being shot at, and people being attacked in the middle of the night. And it's another example of once violence is acceptable, it just mushrooms and takes on a much bigger role. And I'm if you would want to say any other words about that.
Certainly, the current government of Israel is not shy or hiding at all their intention of annexing the West Bank. I mean, sadly, Netanyahu is even not shy of saying that he wants to create the greater Israel, which makes all the surrounding Arab countries at risk now of going through facing exactly what Palestine, whether West Bank or Gaza, are facing. So keep that in mind. But in the West Bank, there has always been dehumanization and attempt to make people's lives miserable. So the little survival things that they do on a daily basis is resistance from going to work or going to school. So in the last 2 years or so, even that has been made almost impossible. The economy of the West Bank has come to a halt. So people are financially strapped, and it is hard for many families to survive because now again there are no tourists going. So keep that in mind. And yes, we can go to Gaza, but I'm hoping that people can still go to the West Bank and support the Palestinians in the West Bank. But it is critical to understand that Israel is not just making their lives miserable. Now they are kicking them out of their own homes, immediately placing settlers in their homes. In not a single city, not a single camp in the West Bank has not been impacted on a daily basis, whether it's Jenin, whether it's Tulkarem, whether it's Nablus, whether even Ramallah, in the heart of where the Palestinian Authority are. The attack on people livelihood, and pushing people, out of their homes. I know in Tulkarm, in Nablus, in Jenin, there are hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who were displaced, pushed out of their homes, made again for the second time probably refugees in their own homes. Of course, some are covered in the news, but not everybody. Not everybody's story is shared on the Western media, but the sources are out there, and I encourage everybody to pay attention and include that in your demand that this ends. And I know, again, President Trump did say that he's not going to allow Netanyahu to annex the West Bank, but saying something and doing something is a totally different. And what is happening is that so far, Netanyahu and his current cabinet are ignoring the rest of the world and continuing their genocide and their attempt to annex and erase any possibility of Palestine. And of course, all the world now is talking about two-state solution. I'm grateful that they acknowledged a Palestinian state, but state on what land? State on what borders? And unless they immediately stop this genocide and stop the killing of Palestinians, what value a state will do if there are no people to claim it?
Thank you for that. I also, when going back to our first speaker, Nicolette talked about the essential part of not just listening, but holding and making sure that people have. I know you said this very clearly, that you push down your own pain, and it's not just about you, but it's like the stories of like bearing witness and the mental health component. I know that, for instance, like the church, the Mennonite Church in Pasadena, has also held space, and along with others, to have space for people to have to talk about not to talk about their mental health, but to hold space for the sharing, because there's something also about trauma. It can be both received directly, right? People who are coming from Gaza, but it's also people watching and bearing witness here and now, and people who have people there. And so, can you describe maybe what happened at the Mennonite Church and how people can do more of that to create spaces for that kind of bearing witness?
Definitely. I know there are a lot of effort to focus on the mental health in general, but the mental health under genocide is totally on a different level, especially children, especially women. I know people in Gaza, and I, as a person of faith, as someone from Gaza, who I consider myself, have a deep root in my faith that impacts how I live my life and how I feel and how I control my emotions. But the people in Gaza, even though they are teaching a lesson of their resilience and their faith in God Almighty, where they're not just asking for themselves, but they're asking what pleases God. And if God is pleased, then they're okay with it. But we shouldn't be considering them as heroes for just their faith and not acknowledge that sometimes when you're backed in a corner, there are different ways that you can react. You can either, sort of like, back, attack those, whoever in front of you, or you can seek refuge in God. It is natural to seek refuge in God, but that doesn't mean that they are not in need of our support. Absolutely, we should find, and I appreciate that Lubna gave the she mentioned, I think, Noor, which is part of a project with Ta'awun that focuses on the mental health of children. So I recommend you find other groups that do this kind of support. And there are resources in Gaza. There were people who were trained to do this kind of of service, even though they are themselves are impacted by the genocide. But we need to find those kind of projects and support them. Now, mental health is for people in Gaza, but then for all of us here are witnessing this genocide. And a lot of people who, I can understand if they are silent or they're afraid because they're shocked, they're numbed. So any of you who feel helpless or feel that you are almost like, motionless, that you can't find a way to act, this means that you are facing a mental issue in dealing with this genocide. And I'm grateful for the Mennonite Church because they do this on a regular basis, where they have these specialists where they come and they invite people to come and share their feelings, share what they're experiencing while watching this genocide live, and there are means to help them deal with it. But the main important part locally here are for the activists. The activists are moving full force, and I see them on the street. God bless them. They are moving full force and almost with no time to look for themselves and the sanity of themselves. And I encourage everybody to take time to be with yourself and ensure that you're not becoming a machine in what you're trying to do. Keep your humanity, continue grounding yourself, and continue looking at the best interest of yourself so that you can do what is the best interest for your cause, for the people who need you, for the people who need your voice, need your time, need your energy, and need your skills. And when the load is distributed on many, the pain and the pressure becomes less. And this is where I'm hoping and I'm inviting everybody to engage, participate. There are visuals and demonstrations within, I'm talking about, now the local Southern California. There are visuals and demonstrations almost every single day of the week. So it's important that you find them and go out there, be with people who are doing the work and coming together to support one another. I look forward to these gatherings because the people are so kind, the people are so generous, they're so they give me strength, and their support for the cause, and many of them are not Palestinians, are not Muslims, are not Arabs, but they're humans, and that's what connects us. So I am sure it will be a good resource for all of us to be with people who are sharing with us the pain, but sharing with us the goal. And believe me, they will empower you to take the next step.
A really essential reminder of how community and genuine, like showing up and kindness and compassion is essential. Thank you so much, Hudab. You've shared so much richness and stepped in um, uh, to help us really understand and unpack how we can show up in the most meaningful ways. We're so grateful for your time.
Thank you, Aziza. Thank you, everyone.
Very welcome. So we are sad to share that Dr. Alden Young is unable to join us today. He is an expert both in Sudan and has so much to say, and it's essential that we also bear witness and pay attention to what is happening there. And we will organize another gathering with him, inshallah, on another day very soon, so we can include this as one part of one larger series because it's essential that we all truly name and bear witness. But for now, I'm grateful also to Dr. Hisham Layer, who has joined us from Chicago. After he has been doing his own travel, Dr. Hisham is our final speaker for today, and we turn to you for the framework that shapes how our world names and understands these kinds of atrocities, but especially our moral imperative in the midst of them. Um, we have had a few speakers before you speak to the essential pieces of what we need to understand in different genocides. And you bring in specifically analysis and the moral insight that we're hoping to lean into in this moment, where we can understand more about international law. We've already had speakers speak to some of that, but really what we can do to lean into justice and from an Islamic perspective, to name the humanity and what we can do to own our moral clarity in this really tumultuous time. Dr. Layer, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Aziza. Bismillah. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. First, I want to thank you very much for having me join today. I'm glad I was able to join live. I wasn't sure if I was, but I think we just about managed it. And I think that this is a very difficult time. You know, this is a very crucial time, I think, in terms of understanding, but it's also a very difficult time. In 20 years of engaging on policy in the United States, in Europe and elsewhere, I've never seen a time like this, not just in terms of the intensity of the images that we see every single day, but the moral questions that come up, not simply as a result of these crises directly, but also indirectly. The impact of how these crises actually ensure discussions change about Muslim communities within the West itself, as opposed to even just being about those crises themselves. That would be bad enough, but it seems that there are other things that have to happen that are going to be incredibly impactful for how these communities develop. How do we respond to that? How do we witness suffering of this magnitude without despair? How do we act responsibly? How do we function? How do we function as people of faith in civic life? And there are a few points that I wanted to get through as quickly as possible. I know you've had a lot of talks and a lot of speeches. I don't want to belabor too many of these points, but there are several things here that I think are important. And the first is really moral clarity. Okay, I think it's important for people to be very clear about their ethical universe, what sort of commitments they have as a result of their overarching commitment. And their overarching commitment, of course, harkens back to that time before time, where all the souls are gathered and God asks all of us, am I not your Lord? Alastu birabbikum? And we say, yes, we bear witness. And that entails a responsibility to uphold a number of principles, bearing witness to the truth in a multitude of fashions, being aware of the suffering and being aware that because we have that awareness, we should be very grateful, because there'll be many who simply don't recognize that suffering is happening, or they don't care. They don't have that feeling in their heart. They don't have that tenderness in their soul. In many ways, internally, they're already dead. So people ought to be very, very aware and grateful that they still have hearts that beat. They still have souls that feel, and to be very clear about that suffering that takes place, naming the wrongs clearly, and not allowing injustice to simply exist without having some sort of challenge, and not being relativistic about it either. Not to say, well, this is happening there, this is happening there. Whataboutism is not really very, very helpful. So I think that's the first thing that is very important in any type of engagement, that we recognize that we have responsibilities and we bear witness to them. The second point I wanted to talk about briefly again relates to how we have a spiritual grounding that comes directly from our tradition, when we talk about suffering and trials and tribulations and difficulties. And we know that the reality of all of this is that everything is in the hands of God, and that God is not unaware of anything, that God is aware of all that we know and everything else and much more. And that when it comes to trials and tribulations on a personal level, i.e., if it happens to ourselves individually, that there are three scenarios that come into play. Scenario one is that the trial happens as punishment for wrongdoing. The second is that it's what we call as kafara, or expiation of sins, cleansing the believer's record. The third is meant to raise people in terms of their spiritual stations, drawing hearts and people closer to God. So suffering is not meaningless. Suffering serves a purpose in the plan that belongs to God. Whether or not we see the overall plan itself, we don't, because we're not God. But as believers, we know that there's nothing that happens except that it happens by God's permission, and that there will be a wisdom in everything happening. And that's the perspective that we have, spiritually speaking, in terms of our own lives, but also on a communal level and also on an international level, that there will always be wisdom. And that part of the wisdom is that we would become aware that injustice is wrong. A great Egyptian sage, Sheikh Sha'arawi, he said once, injustice has been allowed so that you love justice. Alhamdulillah. So I think that that's something on a spiritual level to keep in mind, that even though we don't see the pattern necessarily, and sometimes we do, but even if we don't see the pattern necessarily in front of us, it doesn't mean there isn't one. There is, and it belongs to God to allow us to see parts of it at different times. The third point is that there's a responsibility on a very quote unquote worldly level for members of this community to uphold. People who are in the United States, either as American citizens or simply here as Muslims who reside in the US, irrespective of whether or not they're citizens. And they ought to get engaged in local society and in political life. It doesn't mean everybody needs to go run for Congress or something like that, but to be aware that you have an ability for civic engagement that you should not take for granted, and that you should try to minimize damage as much as possible and increase goodness as much as possible, and in that order. Okay, that's generally the way our tradition upholds, that you try to minimize damage as much as possible and then try to uphold as much goodness as possible. And of course, when it comes to the United States is involved in many of these crises around the world. So withdrawing damage in that regard becomes very important, or would be able to actually push forward good and decent policies that would lessen damage. Insofar as you have the ability to change the way in which policy can actually apply, then I think that that's a duty that people ought to take up. And then finally, the notion of collective action in the spirit of bearing witness to the goodness that exists in every human being that go beyond, policies and politics. There's other types of collective action that I think are important: humanitarian aid, advocacy, awareness campaigns, doing so in a way that is guided by the moral clarity that we see in our religion, rooted in compassion, avoiding reactionary anger, but really rooted in that Muhammadan element of mercy. وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ. And we did not send you except as a mercy to all of the worlds. That I think should be exhibited not simply because of the crisis or because of the suffering that we see, but because that's who we are. That's who we are as human beings. That's who we ought to strive to be as believers, whether times are good or times are difficult. Right now, we see at least one genocide underway. Tomorrow, we might see a reprieve from some of the suffering. It doesn't obviate that in both cases, we have responsibilities. And those responsibilities always have their root in that awareness that we are called to be followers of the man who is sent as a mercy to all of the worlds. So with that, I'll stop there. I was told to be brief, and I hope that this will be useful in some way to all of you. Take care.
Very, very much so. Thank you, Dr. Hisham. I'm grateful for your anchoring us also in our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and reminding us that we shouldn't go into the reactionary anger. And I also appreciate how hard that is, and how essential it is. And I'm curious if there's any ways that you see in our tradition that really help us anchor there, like any practices in addition to clearly the 5 daily prayers and any dua. But I'm curious if there's something that you can help us lean into.
It's a very interesting question. It's one that I hope that everybody, pays attention to, because we are a community of practice. So the practice of practices is very important, and I mean that in a very serious sense. That when we consider our daily obligations, it's not that's not enough. We also have to consider the things that precede it. So people will engage in prayer, for example, and they'll say, "Well, I don't feel enough." And I say, "Okay, so where have you been when it comes to making your ablutions with wudu? And have you focused in wudu? And if you have, then see. If you haven't, then see what happens when you do." When it comes to additional religious practices and spiritual works, the recitation of God's names and beseeching Him through those names and those particular attributes that you are drawn to during these particular times is a good thing to consider. The reading of Asma al-Husna, and not doing too much of it, I should add. This isn't a DIY kind of exercise, but reading Asma al-Husna, once a week or something is something that, I think anybody can do. To do more than that, I'd strongly advise people that if they have spiritual, not crises, but needs that they need to have addressed, then they should go, as they go to anybody when they have a problem, to somebody who has expertise in that field. Again, I don't think it's advisable for people to take on too many spiritual practices on their own, but that they should go to people who know what to prescribe in the same way that we go to pharmacists and doctors to understand what we should be taking or should be doing with regards to our outward health. There's an inner health within the human spirit and soul and heart that needs to be addressed as well. And there are people in our tradition, alhamdulillah, that uphold the science, and this is the science of tasawwuf, that addresses precisely those things.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And my final question before we let you go is one of the big challenges is also seeing people who you have poured so much love into and effort into, and they're in such a different place, especially you named the moral clarity. And I remember speaking to a friend and saying, look, I think it's an essential part of my work is to help turn the hearts, and I see the numbness. I see people trying to push away and look the other way when it comes to human suffering. And her response to me, which I'm still wrestling with, is God is the one who turns hearts, not you. And so, what do you do in those when you counter what feels like a tidal wave, and you're talking about individual humans that you have done so much with, and they refuse, they are in a state of numbness, and it can feel uh, like you just can't get through. What does our tradition say? Like what advice could you give?
It tells us, remember who's in charge. Your friend wasn't wrong. Your friend is absolutely right. It is God who changes the hearts and who turns the hearts. It's not your job to achieve that. That's not the issue. Your job is to make the intention to work towards it and be the tool by which God actually performs that. Whether you succeed or fail is really not the point. God will reward you in accordance with your intention. So that's one. And two, God will be the one that brings it into effect according to what God chooses to do. So I wouldn't feel despair in this regard. I wouldn't feel any type of dejection in this regard, because the point isn't and never has been for you to assume that you're actually in charge of any of this. You're not. We're not required to succeed. We're required to do our best. And part of doing our best is to have a good niyyah, to have a real solid intention. And then بعد ذلك أفوض أمري إلى الله. And after this, to recognize that I turn over my affair over to God, because God is the one that brings it into existence. As believers, we know and recognize that every instant that we exist in this world only happens as a result of a creative and continually creative and creating act by God. That without that, everything would cease. We're not responsible for bringing that into existence. We're responsible for what we're responsible for. So I urge you and urge myself to engage sincerely in forming good intentions, real intentions, not wishy-washy things, but things that are actually real, so that we might be like the man who stood on this massive sand dune in the desert and made dua to Allah that, oh, if only all of these mounds of sand were gold, so that I might be able to give them away in charity. And he was rewarded by God in accordance with that. So God bless you and your work, give you fruition in it, and make it a witness for you on the day of rising.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, and to you as well. I'm so grateful for your time with us, and your intention, your full presence. I'm wishing you safe travels, and as you continue, we're so grateful for you. Assalamu
Barakallah.
alaikum. Wa iyyakum. Thank you. Jazakumullah khair.
وإياكم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. So we're closing out our program. I hope that you have found it to be a deepening of your understanding and to help slow you down, to be able to contemplate and think about what your role can be in alleviating the suffering and bearing witness, and really focusing on the area that you can enrich because each of us stepping in a way that where we bring our strength, just literally focusing in our area is essential. We are so grateful for your time. And we hope to have another program with Dr. Alden Young in the future. Be well. Assalamu alaikum.